Floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, the Council every year discusses the matter of the cooperation between the United Nations and the European Union. We have always welcomed this. We pay tribute to the efforts of the EU as a key regional player. However, with each passing year, serious questions have accumulated about Brussels' global policy, which increasingly has been departing from the ideals that were set out in the post-war Euro project of its founding fathers. Unfortunately, today these trends are only worsening. As for relations between the European Union and the Russian Federation, whereas in the past we said that they were at their lowest ebb in history, now, thanks to Brussels' efforts, they have completely collapsed. This has all created great, sincere regret amongst us. This was not our choice. We are clearly drawing the obvious conclusions from your actions. At the heart of the European project, initially, there were noble and attractive ideas. The peaceful merger of economic and humanitarian potential of participating states, the benefits of the common market, freedom of movement of goods, people, capital, and knowledge, the creation of a shared European identity on the basis of shared values. All of this created a picture of the ideal shared European future. It is completely natural that this picture is something which attracted many, and nor was the Russian Federation any exception. In 1994, we signed with the European Union an agreement on partnership and cooperation. For its implementation is something which we undertook to carry out with a pure heart, viewing partnership in its direct interpretation, namely mutually beneficial cooperation on equal footing that would account for the interests of both sides. In 1999, the President of the European Commission, Romano Prodi, signed on to the Charter of European Security, which enshrined the principle of indivisible security and obligation not to strengthen one's own security at the expense of others. In 2005, a roadmap was signed on 4 key areas, which set out the following. Cooperation between Russia and the EU would contribute to the establishment of a great Europe without divisive lines and would help to shore up international peace and security and would create beneficial conditions for security and prosperity of both the Russian Federation and the European Union. There were hopes that this would permanently end geopolitical competition in Europe and would help us together to forge a secure and economically prosperous community. However, unfortunately, it became quickly clear that the idea of the EU founding fathers were consigned to the past, and in Brussels, not without encouragement from abroad, new goals were formed. Cooperation with Russia is something that the European Union began to see as one-sided, diluting it simply to something which interested itself, and at the same time embracing a policy of strategically pressing the Russian Federation out of Europe. Despite our warnings, the European Union adopted a calamitous path towards NATO and undertook the geopolitical absorption of space around it, disrupting a balance of forces, pitting East against West, and adopting a policy of transforming the alliance from an economic alliance to a military political one. There was a logic of membership in the European Union which provided for the need for economic and political wisdom, and this was jettisoned. As a result of geopolitical concerns, there were countries embraced by the European Union which objectively failed to meet the Copenhagen criteria. With them, they brought an anti-Russian agenda into the European Union, and following Washington's instructions have been actively advancing this, often to the detriment of the collective interests of members of the EU. A stark example was the recent call of the Polish leadership to create a system of defense, security, and peace in Europe that would be targeted against Russia. We know that there are voices of reason in the European Union. They understand the significance and potential of relations with Russia. However, unfortunately, today they are almost inaudible. In the mid-2000s, having moved towards the east, the EU, contrary to its past pledges, placed a choice before its neighbors. You are either with us or against us. And this logic was at the heart of its policy of Eastern Partnership, which in 2009 replaced the policy of good neighborliness. And this was an entirely Eurocentric model designed not to establish equitable cooperation, but to fully establish political systems of participants on the pattern of the EU. Naturally, the Russian Federation could not accept this kind of a format. One of the products of this deleterious policy was the draft agreement on association of Ukraine with the EU. And this was like a mine, which caused a conflagration for security in the balance of forces on the European continent. This agreement, contrary to the roadmap which we agreed to, effectively demanded that Ukraine sever ties with the Russian Federation and essentially become a mere supplier of raw materials for Europe. When the legitimate leadership of Ukraine read closely into the conditions set out and asked for a timeout to assess how this aligns with their national interests, the EU, alongside the US, mounted an anti-constitutional coup. And this triggered a brutal civil war in Ukraine, which has now been going on for at least 8 years. For all of these years, the EU, contrary to the values it has proclaimed, has turned a blind eye to the crimes of the Kiev regime in Donbass and their violations of the Minsk agreements, encouraging nationalism and barefaced Nazism in Ukraine. Had this not been the case, then today we would not have been facing the profound crisis of European security, the key to which we have yet to find. Under the present circumstances, given Ukraine's current militarized, aggressive, Russophobically charged European Union has now put itself forth in full force. And the degree of deterioration of this once peaceful economic association created to prevent a new war in Europe reflects the fact that the head of the European diplomacy, or today's briefer, Mr. Borrell, sounded the death knell of this diplomacy and called, I quote, to win the war on the battlefield. Well, we are following your advice, especially given that Kyiv, encouraged by their Western patrons, has been refusing to engage in any negotiations whatsoever. And these were not mere words. Brussels, through the European Peace Front, which in itself sounds sacrilegious, has already provided lethal weapons to the Ukrainian armed forces and nationalists amounting to 2 billion euros. Then this is not counting military provisions through individual EU member states. Ukraine continues to be flooded with military goods with disregard for all of their own rules on export control, which are set out in the common policy of the European Council governing control of exports of military technology and equipment. It has reached the point that European weapons today are killing civilians in Ukraine. During the recent bombing of Donetsk, 6 people lost their lives, including a child. Cluster munitions were used with markings from a number of European countries. At the same time, despite the fact that there had been previously a declaration that they were completely destroyed. Since the beginning of the armed conflict in Donbass in 2014, thousands of civilians died, including more than 150 children, thanks to so-called assistance from European, and as they call themselves, civilized countries. Now, 15 to 20 people are added on to these atrocious statistics. The European Union eagerly embraced the Atlantic Russophobic banner and without a second thought trampled upon its own values and political values. They're trying to strip EU member states of the sovereign right to determine foreign policy, demanding that they join anti-Russian sanctions, and are outright bribing them and blackmailing their European prospects. On the global stage, the modern-day European Union is engaged in a vile and aggressive way. The entire regions and even continents are being declared zones of their exclusive interests. By harnessing financial and economic blackmail against developing countries, they are attempting to influence their foreign policy choices. In circumvention of the Security Council, illegitimate unilateral sanctions are being levied, and there are threats to states to join them and depend on EU market. The macroeconomic mistakes have been made. There have been ill-conceived energy and financial policies of Western countries, including the sharp uptick in anti-crisis financial influence, accelerating inflation, spasmodic transition to green economy instead of a smooth energy transition, speculation on Western futures markets alongside the sanctions policies of the collective West. This has all triggered the current food and energy crisis. And now they're trying to accuse the Russian Federation of blame in this, and there are unsubstantiated claims about destruction of elevators, blocking of exports of grains, hypocritically asserting that there are no obstacles to that. And at the same time, they fail to mention the prohibitive measures regarding insurance, financing, and reshipments, which were imposed by both the EU and the United States. And they have been turning a blind eye to the fact that Kiev has mined the waters of the Black Sea. The European Union, following its American big brother, is arrogantly dividing states into democracies and those which are not democracies, at times spilling into open colonial rhetoric, calling countries of Africa their backyard and the Balkans their front yard of the European Union. The conflict between Russia and its followers is something which even the Balkans and Africa have been seeing. This is all done in the name of what the West has imposed, headed up by the United States. That is the notion of a rules-based order. We regret the fact that the European project, which in the past was seen as the highest level of evolution of international and communal relations, as a lofty ideal, in and of itself was dealt a devastating blow and lost its historical idea. The EU failed to establish its own positive ideology. It did not become an independent global pole, an alternative project, an arrangement, and now it essentially has been determined itself as exclusive through primitive Russophobia. This kind of a deterioration has been ongoing before our very eyes, and it continues to take place. Europe once declared its own views of a world order and claimed to have its own role in the concert of world powers, has now morphed into the obedient appendage of the United States and NATO. Their attempts to encourage and to make citizens of the EU believe that this is being done to make them stronger. Quite the contrary. This is a policy which is transforming it, as was the case during the World War, into a potential staging ground for conflict between two world powers. How does this benefit Europe or its citizens? How does this strengthen its citizens? In recent years, Russia has become accustomed to depending on itself. As a European and Asian power, we will develop relations with those countries and associations who are independent and not afraid to defend their own interests. Unfortunately, alas, the EU is not among them anymore. However, the Russian Federation is not indifferent about the future of the European Union. The fact that the policy adopted by the current leadership of the EU is short-sighted and dangerous is something which was repeatedly acknowledged by eminent political leaders of the EU, including the former president of the European Commission. We see that the present-day Europe, for the benefit of Atlantic solidarity, so to speak, is severing ties with the Russian Federation, voluntarily shooting itself in the foot. We hope that this process will not become irreversible and uncontrolled. You, Mr. Borrell, yourselves quite rightly said in a recent interview that the Russian Federation and European Union will still remain neighbors on a shared European continent. We do not want to see problems worsen for our neighbors, but if the European Union continues along its present course, continues to transform into a tool of U.S. policy, then these problems will not only affect its residents, but will also affect Russian citizens. Of course, this is a scenario which we wish to avoid. We hope that sooner or later, the anti-Russian frenzy will abate, and in the time, the European project will not completely collapse for the advancement of the interests of American and British colleagues, contrary to their assertions to the otherwise. Madam President, given the clear hostility of the EU as it currently stands vis-à-vis Russia, its reliance on and subservience to the US and NATO, we have no choice but to reconsider the basic approaches to development of relations with this body. We now are forced, at the very minimum, to adopt a cautious approach vis-à-vis all projects involving the EU, including at the United Nations. And this also applies to plans of expansion of the European Union, involvement of new states, hostile states, including Ukraine, in this body under the new circumstances no longer reflects Russia's interest, nor can we fail to note that in the past few years, the EU has effectively deteriorated into NATO's geopolitical shadow, losing not only its own vision for the development of peaceful processes, but also losing any ability to defend its own place under the sun, no longer able to defend its economic, civilizational, and cultural interests. This is not at all how its founding fathers saw it. This is not at all the body with which we discussed plans for strategic partnership. To conclude, Madam President, a long time ago, when the leaders of post-war Germany still wouldn't allow anybody to call them aggrieved liverwurst, Konrad Adenauer stated the following prescient words: unless we act, events that we Europeans will be unable to influence will overtake us. I believe we Europeans feel far too safe. Europe's political and economic leadership in the world, which was still unchallenged at the beginning of the century, has long ceased to exist. Will the dominant cultural influence of Europe be maintained? I think no, unless we defend it and adjust ourselves to new conditions. History has shown that civilizations are all too perishable. It is a pity that succeeding generations of leaders of the European Union have failed to take these words of warning seriously. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation and give